Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for a book talk on Luke Goodrich's latest book, Free to Believe. I want to make a very brief introduction and leave the floor to our guest for his remarks. So, what a challenge is to be anchored in your faith and be open to defending the rights of others with a similar passion. So this lack, this gap is what is laying down in many contemporary problems. That yes, many people do get anchored in their faith, but in the meanwhile they lose the sight of others. Whereas people sometimes prioritize other rights, for some reason start blaming the faith. So we see those injustices on a variety of occasions. So cherishing the commonalities is one thing, but advocating for the other, despite differences, is a whole another story. So we have today with us a prominent leader, an advocate of such advocacy for all, and doing this with a great inspiration from faith. And Luke Goodrich is an attorney at Becket law firm, and which is a prominent institution that has won landmark cases at the Supreme Court in defense of freedom of faith, freedom of religion. And his book that we will hear more about is kind of addressing a missing link in the very debate that keeps the country busy for quite a while, and we may think that will keep the public opinion busy in the coming future. So I will just put a comma here and look forward to what our guest will share with us. Please.
Thank you, Ibrahim, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for being here this morning. So, as Ibrahim said, I'm an attorney. That's my trade, and for over a decade I've been working at the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. It's the nation's only law firm dedicated exclusively to protecting religious freedom and for doing it for people of all faiths. So I've had the privilege of representing, we say, everyone from Anglican to Zoroastrian, everyone in between, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, Christian, and others. And I wrote Free to Believe, The Battle Over Religious Liberty in America, in part because I was attending a gathering of faith leaders back in 2014. Faith leaders who were gathering to discuss religious freedom. These were leaders of denominations, of religious universities, leaders of social service organizations, and they were very afraid about what was going to happen here in America on religious freedom. They were afraid. They also lacked knowledge. And I realized at that point, I'd been doing this, litigating in this area for over a decade, and I felt like maybe I would have something to offer. And in particular, as I've spoken about religious freedom with people of faith in various contexts, I see people falling into a couple different camps when it comes to religious freedom. Some folks view religious freedom primarily as a legal or political tool for protecting themselves and protecting their own rights. You see this among Christian conservatives very often. We think of religious freedom as something that will preserve our Judeo-Christian heritage, preserve a privileged place for Christianity in American society, and that's what drives quite a few Christians to defend religious freedom. You also see other folks who kind of react against that view, who find it distasteful to advocate for religious freedom for one particular religious group, view it as a culture war issue, might even deny that there are significant religious freedom conflicts in America today, and want to kind of write off religious freedom as a significant issue. And then third, there are a number of folks I've spoken with who are just kind of waking up to religious freedom as an issue. They might be tired of the debate between conservatives and progressives, or they might be hearing things in the news and starting to worry about religious freedom, but they're not really sure where to turn. And so that's why I wrote Free to Believe. I want to argue that religious freedom is not simply a political or legal tool for protecting your own faith group, nor is it just a culture war issue that's really a non-issue and that we can ignore. Rather, I argue that religious freedom is a basic issue of justice rooted in the nature of God and the nature of man. And so my book is divided into 3 parts. The first part addresses where religious freedom comes from and why it matters. The second part addresses how religious freedom is threatened in the United States today. And then the third part addresses what we can do about it. What concrete actions can we take to protect religious freedom for the generations to come? And so for the first part of the book, I offer both a religious argument for religious freedom from within my faith tradition, which is Christianity, but also a purely secular philosophical argument for religious freedom and why it matters. The religious argument, again, speaking within the Christian tradition, I'm urging Christians not to view religious freedom primarily as a legal or a constitutional issue, but remember that it's also a biblical and a theological issue. I draw on the book of Genesis, where God creates, it records that God creates humanity in his image. And within the Christian tradition, that means that humankind is created with a capacity for a relationship with God, a transcendent a relationship with this transcendent being. Throughout Scripture, we also see God is pursuing a relationship with, he pursues a relationship with the Jewish people, entering a covenant with Abraham. He also pursues a relationship with all of humanity by sending Jesus to rescue them from sin. And so humanity is created for a relationship with God. God is pursuing a relationship with humanity. And yet, we also see that God never coerces anyone into relationship with him. He leaves people free to embrace or to reject him in accordance with their own conscience and reason and free will. And so, from a Christian perspective, if God himself does not coerce us in relationship with him, how much less should the government? And when the government tries to coerce people in matters of faith, it's exceeding its God-ordained realm of authority, elevating itself above God, and committing an injustice. So from the Christian perspective, that's why religious freedom is a basic issue of biblical justice, rooted in the nature of God and the nature of man, and it extends to people of all faiths. But regardless of whether you are Christian, Jew, Muslim, or a person of another faith tradition, we need arguments that are not solely rooted within our faith tradition. We also need arguments that appeal to everyone, even when they reject our basic religious premises. So I also offer arguments from a purely secular philosophical perspective for why religious freedom matters. 3 basic arguments. One, I kind of lay out why and how religious freedom benefits society by allowing religion to flourish, and that produces good works that benefit all of society and enable democratic self-government. Also, how religion allows diversity and pluralism to flourish and allows people to live according to their deeply held religious beliefs. Second, I point out that religious freedom is a foundation for all of our other rights, because the premise of religious freedom is that there's something within each human being that is off limits to the government. And that serves as the premise for all of our other rights, whether that's freedom from unlawful search and seizure, freedom from cruel and unusual punishment. And if the government can transgress that, enter into that realm within each of us, that realm of conscience, and violate our conscience, there's very little else that the government can't do. So religious freedom, in a very real sense, serves as a bulwark, a form of protection for all of our other rights. And then lastly, I argue that religious freedom is not just something that benefits society or protects our other rights. Religious freedom is a basic human right, rooted in who we are as human beings. And you don't have to make a religious argument for that. Purely philosophically, we can see that every human being is born with a thirst for the true, the good, and the beautiful. We all want that. If we're not seeking the true and the good and the beautiful, we have a diagnosable mental disorder. And so we all have this thirst for truth, goodness, and beauty. We have reason that enables us to choose among competing truths and goods and beautiful things. And we all have an inner voice, a conscience, that urges us to choose good over evil. And even when we're out there seeking the true and the good and the beautiful and using our reason to choose among competing goods and listening to our conscience, we find that we're still not fully satisfied in this life. We want something more. We want transcendent truth, transcendent good, and transcendent beauty. In a word, we thirst for God. Every human being is born with a religious impulse, and by its very nature, that religious impulse can't be acted on under coercion. It can only be acted on as a free act of conscience. And so when the government violates our conscience in matters of transcendent truth, it's violating who we are as human beings and violating a fundamental human right. And so that's an argument for protecting religious freedom as a good in and of itself. So that's kind of the first part of the book, why religious freedom matters. Second part of the book identifies how religious freedom is threatened in the United States today. And I identify 5 major areas where religious freedom conflicts are occurring now and will be occurring in the coming years. The first I call religious autonomy, and this is the right of religious organizations to choose their own members and leaders in accordance with their religious beliefs. And that right of religious autonomy is currently coming into conflict with non-discrimination laws, where state and local governments and other entities are applying non-discrimination laws in a way that would restrict the ability of religious groups to choose their own leaders and members in accordance with their religious beliefs. Second key area of conflict is in the area of abortion rights, where in some quarters it's no longer enough for abortion to be legal under Roe versus Wade. It also has to be socially acceptable and widely available. And if you as a religious person, religious organization, religious hospital are unwilling to facilitate access to abortion, you are somehow restricting access to health care for women and discriminating against women. And so we see laws that are designed to pressure religious organizations to offer abortion-inducing drugs in their health insurance plans, or pressure religious hospitals to participate in abortion. Third major area of conflict comes from the advance of gay rights and the conflicts that presents for religious organizations and individuals that have a traditional view of marriage. And you see these conflicts arising in 2 main areas. One is private lawsuits, where LGBTQ individuals will sue religious organizations or individuals for not affirming their same-sex relationships. The other area that these conflicts arise is what I call the area of government penalties. And this is where the government doesn't wait for a lawsuit by an LGBT individual. Instead, it brands traditional religious beliefs about sex and marriage to be a form of bigotry or discrimination, and imposes government penalties such as the denial of contracts or grants, denial of licensing or accreditation, or possibly also the denial of tax-exempt status. So that's church autonomy, abortion, gay rights. Fourth major area of conflict has to do with non-Christian religious minorities. And how is our legal system going to treat non-Christian religious minorities? Is it going to extend the same protection to them that it also extends to Christians? And particularly writing from within the Christian tradition to other Christians, many Christians have not always been willing to protect religious freedom for people that they disagree with. And I offer 3 arguments why all Christians, all people of faith, and all Americans should care about religious freedom for people they disagree with. The first argument is what I call the argument from self-interest. And even if you're a Christian and you only care about religious freedom for yourself, it's in your own self-interest to stand up for religious freedom for others. because the precedents that are set in cases involving Muslims and Jews and Buddhists and others directly affect religious freedom for yourself. And for Christians, I give the example of the Hobby Lobby case, which in some quarters was controversial. This was a case involving Christians who owned a business and didn't want to use their insurance plan to provide drugs that could cause an abortion. And when my firm, the Becket Fund, won the Hobby Lobby case in the Court of Appeals, the main precedent that the court relied on was a case involving a Muslim prisoner who wanted to maintain a halal diet in prison. And the court said, just like the government was forcing this Muslim prisoner to choose between his faith or a nutritious diet, the government was forcing the owners of Hobby Lobby to choose between their faith and paying multi-million-dollar fines to the IRS. And so a victory for a Muslim prisoner led directly to a victory for Christian business owners in Hobby Lobby. And the converse is also true, that religious freedom losses for religious minorities also have led to religious freedom losses for Christians and people of other faiths. So in a very real sense, our religious freedom is bound up with the religious freedom of those with whom we disagree. And when we defend religious freedom for people we disagree with, we're defending it for ourselves. The second argument I offer is what I call an argument from evangelism. So even if you're a Christian and you want other people to come to faith, just a matter of the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Defending religious freedom for people of other faiths enables them to come to faith without coercion. And if we believe that our faith is true, we don't need the government to force other people to embrace it. We can appeal to them from within the bounds of religious freedom, and giving other people religious freedom gives them the ability to choose freely. And then the third argument I offer is what I call the argument from justice, and that ties back to the argument for religious freedom as a basic issue of justice and a basic human right. And if we believe that every human being is born with a religious impulse, and that cannot be acted on under coercion, religious freedom necessarily extends to people of all faiths, and we should defend it as a basic human right for people of all faiths. So that's the fourth major area of conflict, is religious freedom for non-Christian religious minorities. And the fifth area I call the public square. And these are conflicts over things like religious symbols in the public square, government funding for religious organizations, or religious observances in the public schools. And here I argue that we don't want a public square where the government is promoting religion. We also don't want a public square where the government is hostile to religion and trying to eradicate it. Instead, we want a public square where religion is treated as a natural part of human culture, where the government is not pushing religion or pushing out religion. Rather, it's creating space for religion to flourish, just as it would in the private square. So those are the five main areas where we see continuing religious freedom conflicts. And then the last part of the book is, what can we do to preserve religious freedom? And I look at two main areas. First, speaking specifically to fellow Christians, I think when we ask ourselves what we're supposed to do about religious freedom, we often focus primarily on how we can win in religious freedom conflicts. But within the Christian faith, we're not called primarily to win culture war battles out in the culture. We're called to be like our Savior, Jesus Christ, who laid down his life, who loved his enemies. And so I offer a different way for Christians to think about religious freedom conflicts. Less about winning and preserving our rights, and more like being loving people who care for people of all different faiths. Second, I offer, whether you're a Christian or not, I offer practical steps that all Americans can take to preserve religious freedom for the generations to come. Whether you're a business owner, or a ministry leader, or a person of the cloth, or a person in the pew, or a man on the street, there are practical steps we can all take. The way we structure our businesses and our ministries, the way we advocate in the public square, to make sure that religious freedom is preserved for generations to come. So that's kind of a basic overview of my book, Free to Believe. But I think if there's one takeaway I hope that all people will get from this book, it is that we don't need to approach these issues of religious freedom from a posture of fear. And in fact, here in America, we have it quite good. This book is not meant to be alarmist. We have a strong constitutional guarantee of religious freedom. We have a Supreme Court that has repeatedly protected religious freedom. We have a legal system committed to the rule of law. And even looking at my own law firm, the Becket Fund, over the last quarter century, we have a 90% win rate across all of our cases, and we're undefeated in the U.S. Supreme Court. So we have a lot of reasons for optimism when it comes to religious freedom. We don't need to approach it from a posture of fear. Rather, we can approach it from a posture of joy and optimism and defend it for people of all faiths. So thank you for being here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. How we name and frame a challenge is quite a beginning that will shape our following behavior as to how to solve it, how to manage it. So your suggestion of shifting the term from fear to a more constructive, engaging language that culminates in your book, as a combination that speaks to all stakeholders with a very secular language, with a rights-based language, with a gospel-based language, which is a very valuable input given the sensitive nature of the debate. So thank you for this contribution, and now we turn to our audience for their questions and comments. Peter.
Thank you for your presentation and your work. I guess the thing in your presentation just now that I found curiously missing is religion and interfaith and conflict resolution and the clear demonstrable, I think, evidence that when people get together across lines of faith, economies grow, there's more social and economic collaboration. The Brian Grimm School, and I wondered if you could just comment on that. I don't think you're against it, but why didn't you include it?
Yes, no, not at all. And I do touch on that a bit in my book, in offering non-religious defenses and arguments in favor of religious freedom. Both how religious freedom reduces social conflict. So we have a society today that's deeply divided on a variety of different issues. And the question is whether the government is going to pick one side of those debates, whether that's the abortion debate or the marriage debate, and crush everyone who disagrees, or is the government going to find ways to respect the deeply held convictions of both sides of those debates? And so religious freedom is essential for allowing people of deeply divided views to live together in peace. And I think Brian Grimm's study is especially powerful, showing how much religion itself, regardless of the faith tradition, benefits society. You see that schools, hospitals, social services, soup kitchens, so many of these are religiously motivated. And I've represented many of them myself. I've represented a Christian homeless shelter in Idaho that was facing a lawsuit because of its religious beliefs. We're representing a Catholic organization that for over 100 years has provided foster care for children in need. And I represented houses of worship that were facing new taxes, multi-million-dollar taxes on the south side of Chicago that are doing vital work of peacemaking and caring for the poor in their communities. And so religious freedom is really essential to allowing giving religious organizations space to breathe and continuing to provide vital services that benefit society.
I'd like to talk about some of the hard cases. Roy Moore, you know who I'm talking about. You want to explain that to everyone?
Well, Roy Moore, I mean, he's had many cases.
Okay.
Most famous about the Ten Commandments.
The Ten Commandments is the most famous case. I could come up with a few more. The reality is that the First Amendment religious freedom article also conflicts with the 14th Amendment in many situations. I'm sure you've argued some of those cases. I spent a lot of time studying the history of the South since my family comes from Alabama, and I can assure you that there are quite a few white Southerners who thought that it was their religious obligation to never serve a person of color in their business, whatever, etc. How do you handle those conflicts?
Yeah, so you raise a very important point that comes up a lot in these debates, especially when it comes to religious freedom and gay rights. So
No, I know, but I want to talk about race, okay?
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
So
let's,
it's the analogy.
let's talk about race. I
the
don't
analogy
think
of
it's a
race.
perfect analogy. I think race is a much stronger. We have a direct constitutional amendment having to do with race. We don't really have a direct constitutional amendment having to do with gay rights. That's been read into the Constitution. Let's talk about race.
Yeah, so the law on race and religious freedom is pretty clear. There's a case called Bob Jones University
Yes.
versus United States.
Yes.
And back in the late 70s, Bob Jones University,
With not a lot-
Christian
yes.
university, had a policy against interracial marriage and
Policy,
dating.
they wouldn't admit persons of color at all, period.
Right, but they also had a policy against interracial marriage and
Marriage,
dating, and the
yeah.
IRS stripped Bob Jones University of its tax-exempt status.
Right.
And then Bob Jones sued, arguing that this was a violation of the Free Exercise Clause of the Constitution. The case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled against Bob Jones University, saying that our nation has a terrible history of race discrimination, including in higher education, and that the government's interest in eradicating race discrimination outweighed Bob Jones University's alleged interest in its religious freedom and its religious policy. And so, that's a powerful precedent that
Where would you have come down on that?
I think Bob Jones is a perfectly reasonable decision.
Mm-hmm.
The difficulty today, the more hot button issue today, is the attempt to extend Bob Jones, the logic of Bob Jones University, from the context of interracial marriage to the context of same-sex marriage. So you recently heard Beto O'Rourke, one of the Democratic presidential nominees, say that churches and religious colleges that don't support same-sex marriage should have their tax-exempt status stripped away. And he's drawing on an analogy to the Bob Jones University case, and that analogy is very common in these debates over religious freedom and LGBTQ rights.
Would you make a distinction between them, or do you think that they're similar?
I address this in my book, and I do make a distinction and argue that the way that the law does and should treat race and sexual orientation is quite different.
Okay.
And the reason for that is rooted in our nation's history of race discrimination. So we had hundreds of years of slavery based on race. We had a civil war fought over race. We had government-imposed segregation based on race. And so our government systematically imposed serious barriers for African Americans to participate in
And the
fully.
Supreme Court upheld those barriers. The
Right.
culture shifted, but the Supreme Court at one time upheld those barriers as being perfectly legitimate.
That's right.
So on one level, you could be saying that the culture hasn't yet shifted on same-sex marriage. The
Well,
Supreme
if-
Court did
if
not
you'll-
hold in 1954 what it held in 1896, as you very well know.
Yeah, well, whether the culture shifted or not, what has actually been done historically to African Americans in this country is different from what has been done to the LGBT community. And the Supreme Court has also recognized this. So when the court struck down bans on interracial marriage, in a case called Loving versus Virginia, it said that those bans were based on the beliefs underlying the ban on interracial marriage were invidious relics of white supremacy.
But it didn't
And
do
that the
that until
government-
1967, and before that, there's a whole string of cases in which it upheld those bans, which were common all across the country, not just in the South. California had a ban on it.
So when the court switched in 1967, it condemned the beliefs underlying those bans as invidious relics of race discrimination. By contrast, when the Supreme Court switched on same-sex marriage in 2014 in Obergefell, it went out of its way to say that the beliefs underlying traditional marriage laws were based on decent and honorable premises that have been held by people in good faith for generations and are worthy of protection. You see this reflected in our law as well. Like right now, when it comes to employment discrimination based on race, all 50 states ban employment discrimination based on race, and there are no religious exemptions from those laws. By contrast, when it comes to sexual orientation or gender identity discrimination, there are only 22 states that ban employment discrimination based on those grounds, and yet all 22 states have religious exemptions to those laws. And that's a recognition in the law that sexual orientation and race are different.
Before that, Sheridan, you had a question, I think. Before.
Okay. Lots of thoughts. But, so you were speaking to how you had represented soup kitchens and some other religious organizations. And I was kind of thinking about how many of, you mentioned hospitals providing services and having some reservations about things that they didn't want to do, soup kitchens having to serve people that they might not want to serve, things like that. Many of these services are dominated, or sectors are dominated by religious institutions and are heavily privatized. And I was wondering how you might suggest balancing that out so that people have opportunities to get those, like if they need to go to a shelter and they won't be held based on their race or their drug addiction, or if they need to get an abortion or want to and they can't because they only have a Catholic hospital within 10 miles of their home or whatever. How would you balance out that resource disparity?
Mm-hmm. So that's a great question. So let me start with the abortion example. So the same day the Supreme Court decided Roe versus Wade in 1973, it also decided a case called Doe versus Bolton, in which it looked at, it held that religious organizations can't be forced to participate in an abortion. So the constitutional right to abortion under Roe versus Wade has always meant that the government can't stop women from getting an abortion, but it hasn't meant that the government can force other people in violation of their religious beliefs to assist in an abortion. And so in all 50 states, we have laws saying that religious organizations can't be compelled to participate in an abortion. So the balance there is women are able to get an abortion from a willing service provider. Religious organizations, they're not allowed to stop anyone from getting an abortion. They can't block the entrance to an abortion clinic or restrain anybody.
They can create trap laws. They can do a lot of other
Well, that's the government.
things.
When they create a law, that's the government. I'm talking about private religious organizations. They aren't allowed to stop anybody from getting an abortion, but the law says they are allowed to step aside, to step out of the way. And so the legal right there is a right to be free from government restraint in getting an abortion. It's not a right to command the assistance of others in getting an abortion. And that's been recognized in all 50 states ever since Roe versus Wade.
So how would you suggest that in like homeless shelters and adoption agencies and other things that kind of need that balance, as far as there's a population of people, children, drug addicts, other different people that need those kinds of resources? How would you provide those services to people in an unbiased way? I mean, there are different faith organizations that will provide it, but obviously with conditions, and there might be government entities that have a certain reach that they can, a certain capacity that they can fulfill, but how would you suggest finding that balance?
Yeah, I think adoption agencies is another great concrete example we could talk about. So right now I'm representing Catholic Social Services in the city of Philadelphia. And for over 100 years, Catholic Social Services has been recruiting families to provide loving homes for children in foster care. And just last year, the city of Philadelphia decided that it would stop partnering with Catholic Social Services because it doesn't place children in the homes of same-sex couples or unmarried couples. They deem this to be discriminatory. The problem is there are 29 other private foster care agencies in the city of Philadelphia that provide foster care placement for same-sex couples. And no same-sex couple had ever even come to Catholic Social Services and asked for that assistance. If they had come, Catholic Social Services would have said, here's a list of 29 other providers, several of which are located within 2 miles, and they can help you do that. And so the problem with policies like that is Philadelphia, the nation, has a foster care crisis right now. Philadelphia has a foster care crisis. It announced an urgent need for more families, and yet the same month it did that, it said it was going to shut down Catholic Social Services. And so right now, you have families. Sharon L. Fulton has fostered over 40 children over the last 25 years. She wants to foster more. Her home is empty because the government said you can't get a placement through Catholic Social Services anymore. And so the people who are ultimately harmed by policies like this are children who have fewer homes to choose from. By allowing Catholic Social Services to continue doing what it's done for over 100 years, no LGBT couple is affected whatsoever because there are 29 other agencies that are willingly serving them. So I think in the vast majority of these cases, there simply isn't a scenario where a religious organization is a bottleneck, like the sole provider and there's nowhere else to go. There are many options, and the solution is not to shut down options the government doesn't like, because that doesn't actually help anybody. The solution is to allow more options to flourish and make sure more people are able to have services.
Yeah, ma'am, you had a question.
Good, hi, thank you. My name is Sue Taylor, and I'm with the National Affairs Office of the Church of Scientology, which is just across the circle here. And as part of a non-traditional Christian church and a minority here in this country, I've been working on these issues for over 30 years. But so my question is, again, looking at history, this sort of thing, from my viewpoint, this is just a personal viewpoint, back in the 90s we had a lot more support of religious freedom with regards to government and stuff, but is it true, is it my viewpoint incorrect in seeing that government seems to be nipping away more and more at our religious freedoms? And just to see if I can think of more than one example, I was thinking about the vaccinations issue now that's coming up across the country, especially like in California, of intruding into private lives and saying you can't send your kids to school, or you can get zoning issues, this sort of thing. Is there a common denominator for all these different situations in present time? And is the common denominator federal funding, or is it something else?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think there are a number of different factors that are contributing to an increase in religious freedom conflicts today. And I devote a chapter to that. I think there's been a shift in our culture along several fronts. One, we've already talked a bit about abortion and gay rights, and 30 years ago, traditional Christian beliefs about life or marriage were not particularly controversial. Nowadays they are, and they're viewed in some quarters as a threat to the advancement of modern culture. So I think that's why you see increasing conflicts over abortion rights and gay rights. You also see increasing religious diversity. So more and more Americans are identifying with non-Christian faiths or non-traditional faiths, and the proliferation of different types of religious practices combined with the overall size of government and the vast number of regulations across so many areas of life tends to generate more religious freedom conflicts as well. You also see, even as you see increased religious diversity, you see fewer Americans identifying as religious or viewing religion as an important part of their life. And I think the studies have shown that people who are not personally religious are less quick to leap to the defense of religious freedom for people of other faiths. So All of those factors, I think, are combining to generate increased religious conflict.
I just really want to thank you too for the Becket Fund and your work in this field, because this is again my personal viewpoint, but also the effect the United States has internationally. And there's an organization called the International Religious Freedom Roundtable working for religious freedom around the world. And if the United States goes down on these particular issues, then other countries will follow. So, and again, just from a personal viewpoint of, we all have, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of beliefs, that this is really important to fight for those. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, just to follow up to Sue's, how do unaffiliated people play into your work, or just the rise of unaffiliated people? How does that play into your work and your work on the book?
Yeah, so I think, as I mentioned, there are some surveys that suggest that, there's a difference between unaffiliated and atheist or purely non-religious. So, but I do think the rise of the unaffiliated could have the effect over time of weakening support in some ways for religious freedom. So, if you're not affiliated with any particular religion, when one particular religious group is facing a conflict, there's less incentive to rise to their defense. Also can contribute to kind of that diversity issue, which I think religious diversity is a wonderful thing, but one of the worst Supreme Court decisions on religious freedom was written by Justice Scalia, the Employment Division versus Smith, saying that the government could criminalize the central sacrament of Native American religion, smoking peyote. And Justice Scalia, in that opinion, basically said, our nation is so religiously diverse, it's just impossible for the government to accommodate all of the different religious beliefs. So we need to interpret the Free Exercise Clause very narrowly. So while religious diversity is a good thing, it's also a challenge when it comes to religious freedom, because you can have a tendency on the part of the government, especially bureaucrats, to just say, so much diversity, what can we do? If I have to make an exception for you, there are 30 other religions, so no exceptions. And that poses another challenge to religious freedom.
So it's how do we go with do we take a universalist path or a very particularist path? And as the diversity grows, it comes with gifts and as a package with certain challenges.
Absolutely.
So I want to quote one of your concluding remarks in the book, which you quote from the Bible. In this world, you'll have trouble, and you regard this as a realistic way to put it, not necessarily good or bad, not like in a panic language or in an overly alerted language, but that's the reality of our human journey, and there will be no shortage of such challenges to come. This put on one hand, and on the other hand, your effort and proposal to shift the debate from fear and lack of knowledge and to winning hearts and love. So how do these facts will accommodate each other? How do you reconcile the two points you make in your book?
Right. So I reconcile it first and foremost from a personal faith perspective, as a Christian. So you mentioned the quote. It's from the Gospel of John, and Jesus tells his disciples, "In this world you will have trouble." So he's a realist, and I think when it comes to religious freedom, we will have increasing trouble. But then he says, "Take heart, I have overcome the world." And so for me as a Christian, I can look at our stable legal system, our constitutional guarantee of religious freedom, our Supreme Court victories. I can look at that as a source of hope, and I think that's a legitimate source of hope. But as a Christian, I look for a source of hope that's deeper than that, and it's in the person of Jesus Christ. And he says he has overcome the world. And so within my faith tradition, I can say, look, some of these cases we might win, other cases we might lose. But a loss of a religious freedom case is not the loss of my faith or the end of the world, because I have a hope that transcends this present world. And while I come to that through the Christian tradition, I think that's common to many faith traditions, that our hope is not, does not rest solely in this world that we can see. We have a hope that is rooted in something that's transcendent. And I think we can all approach religious freedom issues from that posture of hope.
Well, I mean, the contemporary realities of life and the current world, I think, dictate such a balanced attitude. It's imperative to hold hope on one hand, and also realize that there will be no shortage of challenges. Well, then we would like to thank our guest for his work, for those illuminating remarks, for those great insights, and thank the audience for their questions and engagement. So please join me in expressing our gratitude.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us.